Awesome. Welcome back, everybody. This is the Myrna Method live stream. I'm registered dietitian Myrna Haag, and my goal is to reverse obesity and obesity-related diseases. And in doing that, it's bringing you little bits of information in nutrition that will make a huge impact in your world. What we're going to do in this video is we're going to talk about how diets don't even matter unless you get the macronutrients right. And we're going to talk about these macronutrients and why getting them right will get you down to your leanest, and I mean leanest and healthiest weight. So it's no mistake that if you become a registered dietitian, you go to school, you do all the biochemistry, you're going to come out with a license, but one thing you're going to learn is that macronutrients have science behind them. And no, you don't just make them up. Oh, I think you should have 70% fat and 20% this and 10% that. There is a reason why the body works optimally when these macronutrients are at a certain amount. And that's what we're going to talk about in this video. Now, little caveat, yes, as a registered dietitian, when I'm in clinical practice and I'm working with patients that have certain metabolic diseases or certain disorders, macronutrients can change, but that's based on a medical condition specific to that person. So what we're going to talk about is the generalization where most humans fall. What are the roles? What are all the implications? What's involved in the macronutrients, protein, fiber, carbs, and fat? So, Sam, if you're ready, let's take it down.
All right, you're all good.
All right. So, let's talk about what they are and why they're super important. So, macronutrients are carbs, protein, fiber, and fat. And guys, this is it. Everything you put in your mouth is from these four things. So there's nothing really more we have to learn. Sure, we have vitamins and minerals, the micronutrients and different compounds, but those are called micro for a reason. Those are the smaller things that make a difference. Those are like the nails for the house. This is the hardware. This is the big thing. This is actually what holds the house together. The carbs, protein, fiber, and fat, if we compare it to building a house. This would be your structure. So macronutrients are nutrients that provide the body with compounds in each one of these that have a huge function, and we need to keep them at a certain amount. And they're required for glucose metabolism, growth. So these macronutrients need to be at a certain amount for the day. Not less, not more, but a certain amount for a reason. So let's talk about the reasons. Protein, which we'll start with, this is what the body uses to build all your cells. So all your cells need protein. That's blood, that's enzymes, anything in your body that makes you, hair, nails, I don't care what it is, every single morsel of you, every cell needs protein to make that cell. And cells are dying and growing every minute of the day. So your body actually makes you every minute of the day, and it uses protein to do that. So you need a certain amount of protein based on your body size. Makes sense because you have more of you to maintain. So on average, 18 to 25% is considered the right amount. So what does that mean as far as you specifically? Well, we have a formula we use. We take your body weight, you divide it by 2.2, that puts it in kilograms, and then you multiply it by 1.2. Now, on average, it's going to be anywhere from 1 to 1.4. And if you're a vegan, which I'll talk about next, plant-based diet, I'm going to put the protein a little higher. But 1.2 is going to cover most of you. So if you take your weight, let's say you weigh 160 pounds, you divide it by 2.2, multiply it by 1.2, or if you're plant-based by 1.4, but this shows 90 grams for a 160-pound person. And what's important about protein is that we want to make sure we get the right amount. Too much cannot be a good thing. Too little is definitely not a good thing. And protein is meant to be consumed not at one meal, but throughout the day. Because the way the body works is when you get up, you get up in the morning and the body is making you all day long. And when you get up in the morning, you've had a long fast, right? You've gone maybe 12 hours without eating, your body has used protein to make you during the night. So obviously for breakfast, it's probably a good idea to eat some protein. So if your body needs 90 grams, like this person who weighs 160 pounds, that means that we want to try to do 90 grams throughout the day on average. So every minute of the day, if you don't eat protein, that 90 gram keeps getting lower. So maybe, 6 hours later, you're down to 70 grams. And then maybe, 12 hours later, we're down to 60 grams and 50 grams. When you start getting down to low amounts of protein, 30 or 40 grams, well, yeah, if you're not eating protein, your body will then eat you. And that's the bad part if you don't get enough protein. And it's not just eating one meal a day, it's eating at least 2 to 3 meals a day of protein in small amounts based on what you need. So if you need 90 grams, ideally maybe 30 grams 3 times. Because if you just have one big meal, so if you have one big meal over here and your body is kind of rolling on that program and it says, well, here I'm going to eat one big meal at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and yet I'm not, by the time I get down to 3 o'clock, the body doesn't know at 5 o'clock you're going to have a huge chicken. So at 3 o'clock, which could be almost 20 hours, of no protein or maybe very little protein, your body will then have muscle atrophy. Your body will then start to eat muscle tissue to get the needed compounds, to get those needed amino acids to provide the body with what it needs to make more cells. It's kind of crazy. So you end up eating muscle tissue to make more of you. And unfortunately, if you eat more protein, it doesn't mean you're going to build muscle. It just means you're going to maintain what you have. The only way you can build muscle is you got to exercise for it. So you eat this big chunk of chicken because you're fasting all day. And unfortunately, you've probably already had some muscle atrophy. And why is that not such a good thing? Because then we can get into a scenario called a skinny fat person. And what that means is their muscles become marbled with fat, because when you gain the weight back, you're going to get fat back because you're not going to get muscle back, even if you eat that big chicken. So what happens is I see in my practice people that might have not gained any weight because they're doing some of this, 12, 15, 16-hour fasting. We know after 24 hours, you're definitely into some muscle atrophy. But if you're a highly active person, you could be eating into muscle a lot sooner, maybe 16 or 18 hours. Now I'm going to say, easily an 8-hour fast or 12-hour fast, you're fine, especially if it's an overnight fast, right? Because your metabolism's going to slow down a little more. But bottom line, maybe you don't gain any weight. So then what happens with the body you have, even though the size stays the same because you still weigh 160 pounds, but you could have less muscle, because that muscle was eaten away. So I call them skinny fats, because a lot of times there are people that are watching their weight and they're doing a lot of this, 2 or 3 days of fasting, and they're really trying to keep the weight down, and they do a good job of keeping the weight down, but they lose muscle in the process. And when this happens, you're going to get a slower metabolism. So you don't need a lot of calories to maintain your body weight. So the more and more you do this, even though you weigh 160 pounds, your percentage of body fat can go way up. In other words, you could weigh 160 pounds and have as much body fat as somebody who's literally 40 pounds overweight because of a lot of this marbling. And when that happens, you're going to get a less of a need of calories. Boo-hoo, because that means you've slowed your metabolism down. A lot of times you'll see this with people with aging because they're like, I don't understand it. When I was like 50 years old or even 40 years old, it seems like I could eat a lot more calories, but now it's a struggle and I seem to gain weight. It's a struggle. I'm 10, 15 pounds overweight and I don't think I'm eating that much more. And you could just be a skinny fat person. So bottom line, what happens when you don't get enough protein? I'm going to say you get fatter. right? And also, you're going to have a lower immunity because just like everything, protein is required to maintain the immune system, and you have a slower metabolism, which, probably means you're going to start packing on some pounds. So what happens when you eat too much protein? Well, extra protein, it's not very efficient, and it causes a lot of metabolic burden on the bones and the kidney and the liver, especially when we're talking about the high animal protein. Don't see this with high plant proteins. It's the animal protein that we see a lot of this. So increases also in heart disease risk, also an increase in some of the bad bacteria. Okay, so we'll talk more about the gut bad bacteria when we get into the fiber. So plant-based proteins versus not plant-based proteins, animal proteins. Well, they're the same quality. Let's just get that myth and throw it in the trash. They're still quality proteins. Your body doesn't know after it's digest a protein coming from a plant or it's digest a protein coming from an animal. It's still the same amino acids. So you're good. You're good to go on quality, but not on bioavailability, because it's just kind of harder to get to those plant proteins. So the body has to really dig deep into those plant sources, and it's not as available to the body to get access to those quality proteins as it is in an animal. So that's the only thing. It's not as bioavailable. So what does that mean? They're still good. It just means you got to eat a little more of them. That's it. Just eat a little more of them. So what I do is I get my plant-based people to be doing a 1.4. They take their body weight, they change it to kilograms, which means they divide it by 2.2, and then I would give them the 1.4. That just gives them about 20 grams more protein a day. And of course, then, to optimally get the protein, we want to make sure we're doing it at least 2 to 3 times a day and not just at one big meal. So when we talk about excess protein, some of the reasons why is that, like I said, it's not very efficient, but it can also cause a lot of issues health-wise. And I'm really talking about anything over like 35%. So the recommendation I'm looking for is 18 to 25%. Even if your protein's at 30%, you're fine. But where we see this is we start getting up higher than that. That's when we're getting into recommendations that are going to be 2 to 3 grams for body weight, right? So what can happen with this is the adverse effects of long-term, okay, not just 1 or 2 weeks or maybe a month of it. I'm talking long-term, high protein, especially the high meat intake, is associated with disorders of the bone and the calcium homeostasis, renal function. So you have kidney and liver dysfunction with this because the liver's got to clean it and the kidney's got to get rid of it. It also increases cancer risk, okay? And as I said, disorders of liver function. And it also can lead to the progression of coronary artery disease. So a lot of studies are saying we really don't recommend excess proteins. And when you look further into some of these studies, what you will find is the disorders that you will see in the kidney has to do with low fluid intake. It can also increase the risk for kidney stones. So protein ingestion increases renal acid excretion and acid loads because you're going to have a higher acid load when you're doing a lot of these animal excess proteins. And what happens is the bones get affected because they're trying to buffer all this acid, and it releases more calcium in the blood. The kidney's got to excrete it. Bottom line, not good for the kidney, can contribute to kidney stones, and also can contribute to bone problems, right? Osteoporosis. That's where the thinning of the bones, when you're pulling calcium from the bones, then the bones are going to get more porous. And this talks about when the diet is high in protein, it generates a large amount of acid in body fluids. We just talked about that. The kidneys respond to this dietary acid challenge with a net acid excretion, and this literally means that the body begins to buffer it with calcium. So not a great idea to do all this excess animal protein. So when we look at fiber, which is the next macronutrient, this is really interesting because a lot of people forget about fiber. And a lot of people don't even consider fiber a macronutrient. They just consider protein, carbs, and fats. But in fact, fiber is a macronutrient. And in the fermentation process of the gut, fiber can actually even release energy. It can actually release ATP. So it really does make it a macronutrient. But the magic of fiber, and this is what I always get so excited talking about, because people, you read about it. Oh, fiber helps with weight loss. And So I know, you're reading it. You're not really understanding fully what that means. A lot of people think, well, it just must mean I feel fuller when I eat fiber. You do. You feel fuller in the gut. It could slow down some gastric emptying. I use fiber a lot when I try to balance people's diet. I have a program I talk about that. So fiber to me is huge, but I am going to share with you some way cool things about fiber that you did not even know about. How much fiber do we need? Let's get that out of the way. A minimum of 25 grams. For most people, I recommend anywhere from 40 to 70. Now, if you're not used to a high fiber diet and you just start to eat fiber tomorrow because you saw this video, well, that can be a problem. You got to do it slowly so your body can build up the bacterias that are required to digest it. And when you don't have those bacterias, which is a whole nother podcast, that is a whole line of irritable bowel symptoms, distension in the gut. That all has to do with digestion and these bacterias. But let's stay on course and talk about fiber. There's two types of fiber. There's soluble and insoluble. Soluble fibers are the type of fibers. And by the way, all your plant foods have fiber. So plant foods, think of a plant food, unless it's been highly processed and they removed the fiber, but I'm talking vegetables and fruits and grains and beans and lentils. All these foods have fiber, okay? And it's the part of the plant that does not hit the bloodstream. It actually stays in the gut. Can't seem to get through the bloodstream. So, what do these fibers do? Soluble fiber forms a sludge, this little sludgy, mudgy stuff inside your gut that traps toxins, and then you just poop it out. Okay, here's the magic of that. It traps some of these bad cholesterols. And there's been a lot of talk how some of these soluble fibers in certain foods can literally lower some of the bad cholesterols, the LDLs, by 20 to 30%. That's a lot. Just because somebody's getting soluble fiber. So these LDLs, some of these bad fats, they get all trapped up in this fiber and boom, they're going out because they're not going into the bloodstream. Okay? The other type of fibers are insoluble and they don't form a sludge. They're like a big scrub brush. They go along the intestinal tract and they just clean within all the crevices, and they actually pull down some of the toxins that may get trapped up in through that colon. And that's a good thing because when you allow food to stay in the intestinal tract for too long of a period, and I hear people say, well, they go to the bathroom 2 or 3 times a week. This is highly toxic because a lot of that feces, a lot of that undigested foods get up in there, and it can really cause bacteria overgrowth. And this can also travel to other areas of the body. We'll talk about that. But the insoluble fibers go in there and just scrape it all down. And then the soluble fibers form the goo and wash it out. So they work as a team. And that's a beautiful thing. So you got the scrub brush, which are the insoluble fibers, and then you got the soluble ones creating the sludge. So fiber is awesome for cleaning the colon. But let's go on because it does a whole lot more. Fiber makes certain chemicals in the fermentation process. So when fiber is being broken down in the intestinal tract, it makes good bacteria and it makes what are called short-chain fatty acids. And these compounds travel through the body and they actually promote health. We have little receptor sites that sit on cells that are waiting for these short-chain fatty acids, which to me is quite amazing. And we'll talk about some studies, and they talk about these short-chain fatty acids. I'm just thinking of an immune cell. They have these little receptor sites, and cells have receptor sites just kind of waiting for the right compound to attach to them to allow that compound inside the cell. And with short-chain fatty acids, certainly the case, this little short-chain fatty acid sees this immune cell, latches on to that receptor site. It also happens in other cells. And when that short-chain fatty acid gets into that immune cell, then that immune cell performs better. It's a better anti-inflammatory. It's better at doing what immune cells do, which is to help clean you of infectious diseases, right? So these immune cells are what keep your immune system intact, and short-chain fatty acids help them do that. And they're also attached to the appetite center in the brain. A lot of other cells have short-chain fatty acid receptor sites, and they do good things. So short-chain fatty acids are a great health benefit. And then there's good bacteria. Now, the main thing with the good bacteria is it's trying to keep balance in the gut with the bad bacteria. Foods make bacteria in your gut. That you just got to know. And certain foods make certain types of bacteria. A lot of high-fat foods will make bad bacteria. And we'll talk about that when we get down to fat is the macronutrient. So a lot of bad bacteria, right, are made from foods high in animal fats, cheeses and meats, and even just animal meats in themselves can make some of these bad bacteria. All the good bacteria are made from plants. It's kind of cool. So what we want to do is we want to make sure we get enough good ones so they can beat up the bad ones, because that's what they do. The good bacteria literally create intestinal balance, because you're always going to have some bad bacteria. All right, that's a myth to think you're only going to have good guys. That's not true. In fact, in some ways, it's kind of good to have some bad guys, because then your good guys get really good at beating up the bad guys. So you create this really good immune system in your gut. But unless you're eating fiber, that immune system isn't going to happen. And that's really the key point I'm trying to make here. Unless you're really getting fiber in the right quantities and the right varieties, this whole process of these short-chain fatty acids and these good bacteria that keep balance doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. And if you're eating a diet that isn't correctly balanced with these macronutrients, that's why I say most diets don't matter if you don't get this right, then you're going to have gut dysbiosis. You're going to have a lot of problems in the gut. When you get a lot of problems in the gut, you get a lot of these bad bacteria. They travel to other parts of the body. And a lot of my other videos, when I talk about cardiovascular disease, I talk about gut bacteria, the bad guys that leave the intestinal tract, and certain bacteria can actually cause lesions, can cause a weakening of the artery wall, independent marker of the lipid panel of your cholesterols. It's like saying, yeah, we got one more risk factor, and it's coming from the gut, and if you're low in fiber, it's going to be a problem. So, to me, that's pretty fascinating, because it's not just about cleaning the colon, but it's about creating these good bacteria, these short-chain fatty acids. It cleans the colon. And what I'm going to talk about next is how it controls the appetite. It actually decreases bad cholesterols because of the fact it cleans the colon. You've got those solubles of fibers that are forming that little web. Of course, the insolubles are scraping all the toxins down for you, but it will decrease bad cholesterols. And that's huge. So when we look at some of these soluble fibers, I'm just going to show you a few because I think a lot of you guys are seeing them before. You can buy the powdered fibers, And this shows that this has 6 grams of soluble fiber. And we can do psyllium husk. Psyllium husk even shows you soluble versus insoluble. So most of these powdered fibers that you're getting are your soluble. And there's some real benefit to that as far as lowering your cholesterol. And so let's go to this study because I think it really drives home the amount that we need. Because I always try to look at random control studies, or, I try to look at the science so I can bring it to you. This talks about those soluble fibers. 1 tablespoon of a soluble fiber is between 6 to 7 grams. And clinical trials reflect 10 to 20 grams of soluble fibers is where you get the real reduction in these bad cholesterols. Now, keep in mind, most fiber foods like beans or any vegetables are going to have, for a cup serving, maybe 1 or 2 grams of soluble. So if you ate like 2 cups of beans, you'll probably get like 2 grams of soluble. That'd be 4. If you did a cup of oatmeal, that's another 4. So that's 8 right there. And if you did a tablespoon of some of these other fibers, then you're going to be well on your way for reducing cholesterol. And in this particular study, it was a meta-analysis, which means they looked at a lot of different controlled trials, and they did a review. And what they found with 14,000 participants, that's a lot of people, right? They showed that this amount of soluble fiber that I'm telling you about, grams wise, let me see if it has the exact gram on this one. Yeah, so it can change the lipid panel by 5 grams. So these insoluble fiber supplements really showed that they had a reduction. I'm trying to see if this gives the exact. It just says it has a reduction in the cholesterols. Doesn't give me the exact amount, but it does show anywhere in a lot of these other studies as much as 20 to 30% cholesterol. So soluble fibers are good in that way. Also, let's talk about appetite control. Now, we all are on to these GLP peptides because that's what the Ozempic, the weight loss drug, is all about. They actually are giving them peptides. They have to give them through the blood, right? They inject them because if you actually try to take them through the mouth, well, the gastrointestinal tract, the stomach would dissolve those. They would break them down because that's what hydrochloric acid does in the stomach. It sort of breaks all those proteins down. So, but here's real simple. You make this in your intestinal tract. You have a system, this incretin system that lines the intestinal tract, and certain foods that attach to this this peptide system create these GLPs, glucagon-like peptides, just like the ones you're injecting and you're paying $2,000 for a month. Certain foods that attach to this system in the intestinal tract, this incretin system, actually produce these appetite controlling peptides, because these peptides, when they circulate in the blood, yes, they do help with insulin. And that's the other thing, is fiber is really instrumental in regulating insulin. But why the GLPs have gotten so much claim to fame is they actually attach to receptor sites in the hypothalamus, in the appetite control center, in the brain, and they literally reduce the appetite. They block those receptors. So that's why people lose weight on it, but this happens with fiber. And I think that's fascinating. So a lot of people say, if you have a lot of fiber in your diet, it really helps with obesity. You eat less. And it isn't just because you feel more full. It actually has a chemical outcome where it can produce these GLPs, and it can actually decrease your desire for more food, which is what this drug also does. So fiber is really instrumental in doing that. And I do want to mention protein as well. So protein and fiber are really two good appetite satisfiers, right? They're good mediators on that. Now, you can't just have a diet of fiber and protein and think you're okay, because you're not. And this is what I teach in my course when I teach people how to eat. You got to get all the macronutrients, and you got to get them in the right percentages, not only for the day, but also at each meal. We're not talking about that in this video. We're just trying to get in your little brain, or your big brain, that these macronutrients are super important, and the percentage you take are significant. So when we look at these GLPs, what we find is that they can regulate the appetite. And this study talks about in the fermentation process, in the gut, when they're creating these good bacteria and they're creating these short-chain fatty acids, they're also helping creating other chemicals that can make you feel good in your appetite, can control that appetite, give you that feel-good, satisfying feeling. And this here talks about in this study how dietary fibers prevent obesity through a reduction of hunger and prolonged satiety. A number of mechanical and endocrine, which are hormonal signals from the gastrointestinal tract. So peptides aren't really hormones, but they kind of act like it, so they kind of consider them that. They're stimulated by fibers and their fermentation products, which are also short-chain fatty acids. Short-chain fatty acids also can go to the appetite center in the brain. That comes from fiber, and so can these GLPs that are also made from fiber. So what's interesting is fiber has a double whammy there. And it says here, it's stimulation of cells that are secreted in this glucagon-like peptide. And these are one of the mechanisms that fiber uses to decrease hunger and create this prolonged satiety. Also, in the fermentation of fibers, you produce short-chain fatty acids, as it says in the study, and this also stimulates this whole satiety along with the secretion of the GLPs, the glucagon-like peptides. So that's where it gets really interesting, because fiber does help control the appetite. And then in this study, it literally talks about how these are all made in the gut, but then they make it up to the brain, and they help. And this, if you look at the green highlight, it says the GLP can also be considered as a neuropeptide, which means it's up in the brain, synthesized by neuronal cells in the brainstem that release the peptide directly into the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is the appetite control center. So these actually go right into the appetite control center, and they help create that satiety feeling. So they also believe these are really important in controlling the regulation of glucose homeostasis, which is all about diabetes. So these GLPs and these fibers, and eating a diet that has these macronutrients and understanding the right amounts you need, to me, is super important. And if you don't get this right, I don't even understand how any other diet can matter. Because diets are just like about losing weight. Oh, I'm going to do the keto diet. I'm going to do this diet. But these macronutrients have a real importance, because that's a science behind eating. All the other is just losing weight. I'm on a diet and I'm going to be losing weight. But it doesn't really tell me what's going on from a health perspective. And so if we go to the next slide, let me see if I can roll this down. This slide talks again about the short-chain fatty acids from the gut microbiota in the gut-brain communication. And this is really interesting because a lot of studies show that there is a biodirectional communication going on between your brain and your gut. And that's huge, because it means that your bacteria in your gut talk to your brain, and specifically in the hypothalamus, which is the appetite control center of the brain. Not only do the bacteria do that, but also the short-chain fatty acids and also the peptides. And these are all coming from fiber foods. So to me, it's like, oh my gosh, fiber's got to be part of your diet, especially if you're trying to regulate your appetite and you're trying to maintain your ideal body weight. And in this study here, they talk about the colon-derived short-chain fatty acids reach the circulation and they reach other tissues, leading to more brown adipose tissue activation. I don't want to really get into different types of fats, but the brown fat, you have yellow fat and then you've got the brown fat. The brown fat, there's a lot out there that talks about how that actually helps with weight loss and energy regulation because how it works in the mitochondrial function. So bottom line, these short chain fatty acids help in increasing those kind of fats, which are really good. It also increases B cells in the pancreas, which is the insulin. So it helps regulate this whole energy homeostasis. And once again, where is this coming from? Fibers. So I think that fiber has got to be a part of our diet. And then the last thing I want to talk about is these short chain fatty acids. Not only do they attach to immune cells, let me go back to this study because I think this study might have even talked about the activation of them on, no, I don't have it in the study. Anyways, they do attach to the immune cells. They have receptor sites, these short chain fatty acids, but they also, in this study, talk about how these short chain fatty acids can stop this enzyme activation at the end of our chromosomes that are responsible for aging. So as you age, your chromosomes have these little telomeres, and at the end of the chromosomes, the more you age, the more these chromosomes begin to shorten. So by the time you're 90 years old, you're going to have shortened chromosomes, which I guess is why we have a lot of mutations and functions in aging. And bottom line, we do not want short little chromosomes. We want to keep them long and lengthy because that's an anti-aging. So what you need to know, which is fascinating, is these short-chain fatty acids, they actually stop the enzymes that unravel these chromosomes. They're instrumental because, once again, like I said, they have different activation points, and this is one of them. So actually, fiber could be an anti-aging macronutrient. And in this study, it talks about there's now an abundance of evidence to show that short-chain fatty acids play an important role in the maintenance of health and development of disease. Well, we just went into that, right? Short-chain fatty acids are a subset of fatty acids that are produced by the gut microbiota during the fermentation process. The major short-chain fatty acid signaling mechanisms have been identified to inhibit the histone enzymes. These are those little enzymes that are shortening our chromosomes, and these short-chain fatty acids inhibit those enzymes to do that. So that's another amazing thing fiber does. So when we talk about fiber, and a lot of people just discount it and they don't think they need it, it's super, super important. And that's why it makes the macronutrients in the 4 things we need from the food we eat super important. All right, let's talk about carbohydrates, because this is the one that everybody gets all tied up over. And it's super important to understand that every one of these macronutrients have a function. Okay, so you can't just say, well, I'm going to eat a protein and fiber diet and think you're going to be done with it. 4 things all your foods have. Oh, they might have one of it or they might have all 4, but there's 4 things. Just 4 things you got to remember about eating. Just 4. I mean, it's not like you got to remember 20 things. Just 4 things. Protein, fiber, carbs, and fat. How they work, how much you need. To me, that's pretty simple. And if you don't get that, I don't see how any other diet matters. And a little caveat, once again, you have some kind of metabolic issue, you have a chronic disease, because there are certain autoimmune diseases. I'm not saying that there isn't some clinical good reasoning why some of these macronutrients may have to be really taken down to a much smaller level because they have a metabolic, they have a problem, they have a disease. I'm talking the rule of thumb for probably at least 80% of the population that don't have something that is having them change these macronutrients to a severe level, like all these keto diets. And I'm going to talk about keto diet because, there is a I think a situation that could be warranted, right? And that would be somebody who's really morbidly obese. They have some metabolic issues, but it's not where you want to keep them. Seriously, if you have a disease that can be fixed and you lose weight, you're going back to eating macronutrients the way they're supposed to be eaten, period. But if you have a disease, that means you're highly imbalanced because you have a disease. Yes, and then as a dietitian, I might have to make some adjustments. But at the end of the day, I cannot ignore the science. You need a certain amount of protein, fiber, carbs, and fat, period. That is just the science. So when I look at a carbohydrate, because everybody discounts them and says, well, I don't need carbs. Well, you could probably do without carbs. I'm not going to lie, but not do well. It's not going to be optimizing and actually can cause a lot of weight gain if you don't get this macronutrient right. This is the macronutrient that gets all the blame for being overweight, but it really is about getting it right, not getting it less. And that's what I want to talk about. You need anywhere from 40 to 50% of your daily calories from carbs. Now, a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, I don't even get 20%. I don't need it. But you do need it. And let me explain why. So when we look at carbohydrates, what happens when you don't eat enough carbs? Well, first of all your muscles in your body want one thing from you, and that's called glycogen. Muscles store glucose so that they can use it for vigorous energy. Now, who doesn't want to be vigorous? You want energy. That's a huge sign that you're healthy. Okay? And if you don't get the carbs right, you're not going to be healthy because you're going to compromise your energy system. Now, there's some things that can change that, and we're going to talk about that because I think that if I don't talk about it, which I really think is almost another video because of understanding when you get to a certain level of obesity, how your hormones change and literally your metabolism changes. And yes, then you're going to be somebody that's going to probably need carbs at a lower level, 40%. But there's science why. You don't just wake up one morning and say, I'm going to put my carbs at 40% or 20%. You don't walk into the gym and the trainer say, well, we're going to do a diet and we're going to put your fats at 80% and your carbs down at 10%. That is a diet. It's not science. Okay? Unless they're a clinical person and they're doing it for some kind of medical reason, this is not good science because you need carbs. But if you have a metabolic problem, these carbs do change. But once you get rid of your problem, once you lose the weight and you start fixing your metabolism, my God, that's the goal, then your carbs actually increase. Or if you're highly active. So let's talk about carbs and how that works. So when you eat too little carbs, you will have fatigue. You will have increase in dehydration. And it'll actually trigger a craving for more sugar, more carbs. It makes you hungrier. When you eat too many carbs, believe it or not, this is why you have to know how to eat them and balance them. It can trigger excess insulin, which will actually increase your appetite. So here we go. Don't eat enough carbs, and you will have an appetite for more carbs. Eat too many carbs and you'll have an appetite for more carbs. So let's talk about the two mechanisms that are causing this, because there are two different reasons why that goes on. So let me get right into it. And some of you guys have already seen this for the 100th time, but we're going to do it one more time because it deals so much with weight loss, and this deals so much with the macronutrients, is insulin resistance in type 2 and type 3 diabetes. So every time you eat a carbohydrate, it breaks down to glucose, and that glucose enters the bloodstream. Now, If you ate some protein and some fiber, you would slow down that process of glucose. But let's say you didn't. You just ate a big glass of lemonade. So what's going to happen is you're going to get a lot of sugar in the blood, and at the same time, the body is going to release a lot of insulin. So the insulin are the little keys. As soon as you have all this sugar in the blood, the insulin is released for one purpose. The insulin is trying to attach to a receptor site that sits on your muscle cells, because muscles want glucose. Muscles want sugar. Muscles can't get sugar until insulin attaches to that receptor site, communicates to chemicals within the muscle cell, and then it allows the transporter to come to the surface of the muscle cell. Now, of course, if you're exercising, this will happen naturally for you. You don't even need insulin to attach to the receptor site, because when you exercise, your muscles are very open for business. They want to get the sugar inside them. So the whole idea is the muscles want to get sugar inside them. They need insulin to do this. And when sugar gets inside a muscle cell, it binds with water. That's why it's called a carbohydrate. And this actually helps you hydrate at the cellular level. This is a good thing. Muscles would like to have a certain amount of sugar. Now, here's where it gets really interesting and why the macronutrient percentage can get so skewed with people, and they don't understand how this works and how it can be a benefit for you if you don't understand how it works. So if you're athletic or you're active, your muscles are going to want a higher amount of glycogen. How much do we need? We need for our body to get the right amount of carbs anywhere from 150 to 250 grams a day. Now, some people are going, oh my gosh, I'm diabetic, that's too much. Well, that's where you might be at the lower end. But maybe not if you're an athlete and you have type 2 diabetes, because you probably are getting type 2 diabetes because your diet's not right. And it doesn't have a lot to do with glucose. Glucose is a product of it, not the root cause. But anyways, my point is, this is the storage capacity on average for most humans. If you're a bigger person, you have a bigger capacity. If you're a smaller person, that means you have less muscle. But here's another thing that determines the amount of glucose that muscle desires. And I say desire because if it doesn't get what it desires, then it craves more. Meaning if you lower your glycogen levels too low in the muscle cell, you begin to crave sugar. This is very different than having a lot of insulin in the blood, which I'm going to talk about. So if you don't get enough carbs, maybe because you have insulin resistance. And what is insulin resistance? Insulin resistance is when that receptor site gets all clogged with too much fat, because those fats are released from your fat cells and eating too much dietary fat, which we're going to get to next, because that's another macronutrient you have to know how to eat. What happens is that this receptor site gets clogged, this transporter never makes it to the surface, and then the blood sugar piles up outside the muscle, trying to get in, and it can't, and it actually goes into a fat cell, and you become fatter. But here's what happens. The muscles never got the carbohydrate. So the glycogen stores never got met. When that happens, the muscle sends a signal to the brain and says, hey, how about those carbs, dude? Really, how about those carbs? Especially if you're super active. Because if you're active, you are going to tell the muscle, if you're active, to increase the capacity of carbs that it can have. So if you're super active and you're an athlete, you go to the gym once a day and you're in there for an hour, you are going to trigger your muscles to be more demanding of carbs. You're going to increase the capacity of carbs for your muscles. Let's say you're 100 pounds overweight and you're inactive, because if you're 100 pounds overweight, I doubt you're super active, right? Because it's not even going to work out for you, because you're going to have a lot of stress on the joints. So let's just assume you're 100 pounds overweight, you're not very active. That glycogen store, that capacity in the muscle also goes down, which is why if you are obese Maybe you have diabetes. Yes, maybe 40% of the diet's going to work for carbs because that's about all your muscles are demanding. But if you're active, it could be as high as 55%, maybe even 60% if you're a marathon runner, because the muscles are screaming for more carbs. Okay, why is this important? This is a major component in teaching people how to eat as a dietitian. And it's like, if your eyes are rolling in the back of your head, I get it. It's a lot of information. The point I'm trying to make in this video is these macronutrients have a scientific justification. And you don't just wake up one day and say, well, I think I'm just going to take my carbs down to 20%. Because it isn't going to work out well. Because those muscles, especially if you're going to the gym and you're active, they're going to really demand more sugar. And when is that going to happen? Well, you know what I'm talking about. You have a meal of just fiber and protein, vegetables and lean protein. You got your olive oil, so you're satisfied. God knows you ate 2,000 calories. You shouldn't be hungry. And you know what happens? You are dying for the bowl of ice cream, which turns into a bigger bowl, or the granola that was just going to be a little bit turns into a lot of it. Bottom line, you can't seem to control yourself. Well, this is low glycogen, and it happens a lot with my athletes. Okay? That's one way that carbs are pretty significant. And so we want to try to eat carbs, guys, with fiber and protein, because I don't want carbs rushing into the bloodstream. So when I'm doing diet plans for my patients, it's like I'm taking those carbs, and that's why they're called net carbs, right? And I'm really trying to slow down insulin. So let's talk about insulin next. Because if you have too many carbs, then you're going to have another problem. So let's say you just eat a lot of carbs, but you don't eat any protein with it, you don't eat any fiber with it, and those carbs enter the bloodstream like a bad boy, man. They're just going in super fast. You're going to get insulin rushing super fast. And what happens is insulin releases into the blood. Then what happens is you have this situation where now the glucose is getting to these muscles, and if they have insulin resistance, which happens as you get older, this never comes to the surface. So all of a sudden now they have a situation, they're trying to get glucose into the muscle. Of course, it's because they're eating too much fat, because the root cause of type 2 diabetes is too much fat, either too much body fat that releases fatty acids, or just too much dietary fat clogs up these receptor sites. Also increases immune cells in this area. It gets to be a real inflammatory mess. But bottom line, you have insulin resistance, you're eating carbs, you're getting fatter. You're getting fatter because, and you're getting hungrier, because as these sugars are trying to get into the muscle, then the pancreas is releasing even more insulin. It's so confused. So it's releasing more and more insulin because it can't get the sugar where it needs to go. And when this happens, when you have a lot of insulin in the blood, you're going to be hungry. Not real hunger, not the kind of hunger that you should get when you can control your appetite. This is where you're really starving. And I think it's the reason why a lot of people on these GLP, some people work really well with Ozempic and some people don't. And I think it depends on what stage of diabetes you are, at what level this insulin is being released into the blood, because it is at different levels that you become more and more insulin resistant or more diabetic. But I'm going to tell you something. You got insulin in the blood, you got hunger in the body. So this is going to create a situation where you just don't know how to turn the spigot off. You do seconds and thirds of meals because you're not understanding how to eat to balance these carbs. But bottom line, what I'm trying to say is you can't just eliminate them. If you eliminate the carbs, because that's what a lot of people do. They say, well, I'm just not going to do the carbs. And then isn't this going to be wonderful because I'm not going to do the carbs. So therefore the insulin will not be a problem, which is true. You won't have the hunger, but your muscles are going to be screaming for carbs, okay? Because the glycogen is going to be low, which when I teach people to eat, it's like you can't just look at one thing when you look at dieting, but these macronutrients matter. So if I could just get people to understand how to get the macronutrients right, everything else falls in line. And with carbs, if you are overweight, and you're not very active, you'll find you don't really need a lot of carbs. You find you can get satisfied easier. Maybe you're not a binger, but you're diabetic, so 40% may work fine. But let me tell you something. If you're active and I'm putting you at 40% carbs like the Zone diet did, I think it was like, what was it, 30, 30, 40? They had your carbs at 40%. That worked fine if you were like really overweight and you had some, diabetes or whatever, because you weren't demanding. But man, that diet didn't work if you were athletic. It was a disaster, actually, because 40% carbs would never cover you. You're going to be a little binger. You're going to come home. You're going to eat great during the day and say, oh, I ate so great during the day. And then you're going to be a pig at night. I mean it. You're going to just have all these addiction issues because you were a baked potato away, literally a baked potato. You really needed 50% carbs in your diet so that you can balance out that hideous appetite you're going to have all night long, and you're going to end up eating 3 times the carbs you would have eaten if you would have done it right by keeping the macronutrients where they need to be. So that's a mouthful. Let's get right to fat because I don't have a lot of time. Fats are also called fatty acids, but the deal with fat, and I think I've already kind of went into this, is that they are one of the biggest culprits for insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes. They also contribute to gut bacteria overgrowth. They're also associated with an increase in heart disease and certain cancers. And the biggest thing with fats that I talk about is when you have an excess of them, because your body, it's a macronutrient. We need to know that we need just a certain amount and we're good. When we talk about how much fat we need, it's really going to be anywhere from 20%. And I say 20% because I have certain people with cardiovascular disease, certain issues, certain genotypes. I'm going to put their fat lower, but it's going to be 20% to 35%. And for most people, I say it's 30%, right? Because I'm like, if I can get a third of your diet fat, we're good. Because fat does help in for good reasons. All your cell membranes are made from fat. So I'm not saying fat is a bad thing. Once again, these macronutrients need to be in a certain amount. That's the takeaway here. And I'm trying to give justification to why a lot of these diets that give no justification to macronutrients means that they're really missing the picture as far as health and also as far as maintaining your weight long term. So a lot of these excess fats, as we said, can really cause a problem up in these receptor sites. And if we look at some of the studies, they can also cause gut bacteria problems. In this particular study, it talks about the high-fat diet altered the composition of bacteria. It's displayed by a higher level of bad bacteria, Firmicutes, versus some of the other good bacteria, Bacteroides. So basically what happens is that these gut bacteria are promoted in a high-fat diet. So this study talks about the impact of gut bacteria on human health and diseases. So particularly, and I probably could have put that in the fiber section too, because the fiber helps clean those, right? Because it helps get some of those bad fats out of your body. And this just talks about high-fat diet may disrupt gut bacteria and fuel anxiety. Yes, because we have found that these bacteria that come from this high-fat diet actually can communicate to the brain. The hypothalamus can make us desire more fat foods, which is kind of creepy, and it can also contribute to depression and anxiety. And this talks about the high-fat diets, like the typical Western diet, have been associated with obesity and mental health disorders like anxiety. So they're finding out that the gut bacteria is really implicated with depression and mental anxiety and mental disorders. And what contributes to these bad bacteria is a high-fat diet. It says a new study in rats suggests that obesity caused by a high-fat diet may alter the gut microbiome and gut-brain signaling, contributing to changes that promote anxiety. So the key I also want to make is I'm not saying a low-fat diet. I never said I am an advocate of a low-fat diet. I am an advocate of nutrition science. That's why I'm an RD, right? And that means the macronutrients are super important. If I didn't put the science with the macronutrients, then this doesn't mean anything, honestly. And I know a lot of people are going to poo-poo it, but there is science on what each of these macronutrients do for you functionally, okay? And I think it's important somebody start talking about it. And also, and this just is more about a high-fat diet, can also increase the risk for some cancers. And by the way, if you're eating a low-fat diet and you're creating all this insulin, let's just go there, right? You eat a low-fat diet, but you don't know a doggone thing about carbs. You're eating all these carbs. You are going to be a mess because you're going to release all this insulin. You're going to be hungry all the time, and you're going to get fatter. And then when you get fatter, you're going to start releasing all these fatty acids. So I just want to say that it's about these macronutrients being in the right amounts and knowing how they work in the diet. And then just kind of understanding what food is, what's in food. And I kind of did this little diagram. Like we think of an ounce of cheese. An ounce of cheese is 75% fat, 24% protein, okay? And when you look at some of these other things like avocados and nuts, they're very high. I think there was a typo here. No, that's right, yeah. Yeah, when we look at cheese, we're looking at cheese at being 5 grams of protein, and that's 24% when you look at an ounce of cheese. But of course, if you need 90 grams of protein and you try to get it from cheese, that'd be a whole lot of fat. You'd be way over. Your macronutrient would be way off, and you are going to be in trouble because macronutrients mean something in nutrition science. And even when we look at avocados, yes, they're good fats. I'm not saying avocados and nuts aren't good fats, but excess is the big word here, guys. The macronutrients have a certain amount, percentage-wise, they like you to be at. And looking at what some of your foods are, I think in fat, is kind of eye-opening. So when we look at peanut butter, everybody thinks of peanut butter, these nut butters, as being high-protein foods. They're not. They're high-fat foods. They're 72% fat. Salmon, great fish. Love it. Great. Okay. But still, 55% fat. So I think looking at your food and knowing how these macronutrients work in your food is important. So what I am trying to do in this video is just give science behind the macronutrients. That's it. Not really telling you how you balance it in a diet, because that would take a lot more work to explain that. But I believe when I look at the internet, there's so much out there that this doesn't matter. That people are just telling you, yeah, you can eat, sure, 70% fat, you'll be fine. Sure, you can do 50% protein. There is metabolic science, there's science behind how these work and what amounts are required to have you work optimally. So I think that pretty much covers it. I went 3 minutes over. Let me just see if I have anything else here.
Go over the time if you want.
Well, I also want to be respectful because people don't want to listen to me for hours and hours. I want to get good information to you. I want to also leave it open if anybody has any questions. I also want to look at when you look at a label, understanding these macronutrients, that is where you're going to see a lot of these macronutrients, right? So if you understand the grams that you need, and I went through with the PowerPoint, so let me just write it here for you guys. So if you look at protein and you actually do that math for yourself, you take your body weight and, hold on, see if I can lock down this screen. You take your body weight, hold on. Okay, let me see. Samantha, maybe I can get the tech person to help me.
Yeah? What's wrong?
Can you lock my screen down? Why can't I write on it?
You should be able to.
Okay, if I remove the girl, maybe I can. Let's see. All right.
Is it not able to lock?
Yeah, there we go. So if you take protein, okay. For some reason, it's not writing. That's okay. That's okay. So if you take your body weight and you divide it by 2.2.
Try it again. It might work.
Okay. No, didn't work. Hold on. Okay, here we go. Now it's working. Okay. So if you take protein, to get protein, you take your body weight, right? And a lot of times I tell people, because, they don't like to do the math. Even if you took your body weight and you divided it by 2, you'd be a little bit under, but you'd be pretty close, right? This would be the minimum. But if you took your body weight, you divided it by 2.2 and you multiply it by 1.2, you're going to get the amount of grams of protein. So you can look at a lot of labels, and like if this is 12 grams, and I guess if you had it with milk, or maybe you used almond milk and then you put a little bit of protein powder in there and you brought it up to 20 grams, that would probably be pretty good, right? Because you'd be getting a little closer to maybe that 60 to 70 gram mark that some of you may be at. But the idea is that you're able to look at the food labels and now make sense of some of these macronutrients and the importance. I like to give people a minimum of 25 grams of fiber, right? So if I looked at this has 13 grams of fiber. And when you look at something like white rice, it has 1 gram of fiber. And when you have 1 gram of fiber, you're going to have a lot of issues with carbs rushing into the bloodstream too, right? So we want the fiber to really bring that weight loss, the appetite control, create these short-chain fatty acids. And that's why for most of my patients, I'm saying, hey, let's try to get at least 35 or greater. I try to get them between 40 and 70 if I can. If they can tolerate that, they may not be able to do it all at once, but we sort of grow into that after a couple months. If you have a lot of problems with fiber, it's because you're probably not used to eating it. And that's where a lot of IBS comes in. And, you've got to go slow on it and build it slowly. And then you look at the fat grams. So on average, I tell people 60 grams of fat a day is pretty much going to cover most people at about 30%. If you're a little person, maybe 50. If you're a bigger person, maybe 70 or 80 grams. But 60 grams is pretty average, 60 to 65, right? I think that'll pretty much take most people anywhere from the 25 to 35% mark. Okay, well, if you look at the fat grams, like a lot of times you might have something that has a lot of protein and maybe doesn't have any fiber. But so when you start understanding how these macronutrients work, then food starts making a little sense to you. Because then you go, all right, I know that if something has 20 grams of fiber in one, or 20 grams of fat in one serving, and I need approximately 60 for the day, or 65, that means I'm doing like a third of my diet of fat in this one little food part here. 1 tablespoon of olive oil is 15 grams of fat, okay? And, I'm saying olive oil is healthy, but not when you're doing 3 or 4 tablespoons of it. I know the Mediterranean diet says, oh yeah, but they got to look at the macronutrients. The Mediterranean diet has a lot of really healthy foods for you. But it doesn't matter. These diets don't matter until you also take the science, the nutrition science of the macronutrients. Now, a lot of people aren't going to like this because it's going to go against whatever it is they got going on. But, and there's going to be special medical cases. Like I said, I'm not talking about those. But I am just laying down nutrition science and showing you how it works. Okay? This is not a diet. It's nutrition. So also looking at high fiber carbohydrates, I'm always going to recommend that, right? For many reasons, everything I told you about with fiber. Plus, it slows down those carbs. And no, you can't just have as many carbs as you want. You got to figure out how much you need, and you've got to balance those with fiber and with protein. Slow them down. But to say you don't need carbs, that's a problem as well. So some studies found that consuming a higher than usual amount of protein in your diet may offer benefits. Doing drinks with high protein drinks, excess amount of protein does not make you more muscular. If your body takes in more than it needs, it just discards it, which puts the metabolic burden on your liver and your kidney because it has to get rid of that, creates more urea, creates more uric acid, it creates more of acidity in your body when you're doing that, when you have excess amounts. So not a great thing. So anyways, let me see if there's anything else here. So yeah, that's the thing. Are there problems with diet ratios that are recommended? Like I said, if I have a person who is obese, diabetic, they're not very active, then I'm going to be more sensitive with those carbs. As they lose weight and become more active, those muscles change. They become less insulin resistant, especially if I am watching their macronutrients and putting them at the right percentages. and that diet's going to change. So if they started on a low carb diet, maybe they started on a keto diet because they were really in trouble with carbs, as they slowly lose weight and become less diabetic, you betcha, I want them back on a diet that's going to bring them up to 40% carbs, maybe even 45%, because they'll be able to handle them and their body wants them. Typically, a lot of these diets, the people that have metabolic problems are put on because they have the metabolic problems, are the worst diet possible once they get down to their ideal body weight. It's the worst diet. You need to not do it. Okay? So I think when we look at why some of these ratios are recommended in different amounts, typically with people that are struggling with insulin resistance, who are really overweight, then I can understand why it would be a lower carb diet. But like I said, it's not sustainable once you lose weight. Different diet, different body. Okay, so let's get to some questions. If someone has been eating keto or high-fat diet for a while, how long does it take to reverse the damage from these ceramides? Really good question. I'm not sure. I'm trying to find, there's a Dr. Scott Summers from University of Utah. I am going to be contacting him because there's so many questions. He's one of the leading researchers with ceramides. I can tell you that as you start losing weight, and really weight loss in general, when you lose weight, you automatically change your body. From the standpoint of insulin resistance and diabetes. In fact, a lot of times when people lose a lot of weight, even if they're doing it on a keto diet, we're going to see the reversal of diabetes, sometimes great laboratory values. Of course, if you watch my video on diabetes, you'll see I kind of bring that fallacy into play. But that's going to reverse those ceramides because you're losing a lot of body weight, a lot of fat, okay? If you are doing the macronutrients at the right ratios that they should be at, that's also going to start reducing that. So I don't know exactly the answer to the question, exactly how long, but I do know that when you start fixing the diet, they start reversing pretty immediately, okay? So I hope that helped. And any other questions? Don't forget to hit the like button. Thanks, Sam, because I am really bad at the whole marketing thing inside of this. But I do love your comments, guys, because it really fuels me. No comment's a bad comment, ever, ever. It just lets me know when I need to drive home. So please, if you like what I'm doing, hit the like button. If you don't like what I'm doing, don't hit it. And subscribe to the channel. And yeah, obviously, I appreciate all of you. It's my passion. I want to reverse obesity and obesity-related diseases, and I think the best way to do it is to educate. So we're good? All right. See you next time. All right.